Hello, I'm Jesse Goldberg-Strassler with the Michigan Baseball Hall of Fame and with the Lansing Lugnuts. And I'm joined now by Mitch Lutzke to talk about the Page Fence Giants, who are going to be inducted into the Michigan Baseball Hall of Fame on Saturday, June 19th. And just to introduce Mitch, Mitch Lutzke is a high school history teacher at Williamston High School. He's the coach of the track and field team. He sat on the bench of a JV baseball team that went 0-22, and more importantly for our measures, in addition to being a history teacher, a historian, a fellow member of SABR, Mitch wrote the book, The Page Fence Giants, A History of Black Baseball's Pioneering Champions, won a Michigan Notable Book Award, really bringing the Page Fence Giants story to the fore. Mitch, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Jesse, to you and the Lugnuts for having me here.
When did you first hear about the story of the Page Fence Giants?
I was researching a local history book in about 2013, 2014. And in 1895, Lansing had a minor league team called the Lansing Senators. And Williamston wanted to capitalize on this baseball boom. So they set up the Williamston Baseball Association also in 1895. And they built a little stadium and they tried to lure teams to play, both local teams, semi-professional and professional, including the Lansing professional team. And when I was doing the research, I noticed that the Williamston Baseball Association was trying to lure a really good team called the Page Fence Giants, which I had never heard of. And over the course of researching in 1895, I found out that they were a very competitive championship black baseball team. And they eventually played in Williamston. And I just put it on a sticky note and didn't really think much about it because my chapter dealt with actually local baseball, Williamston playing Mason and Weberville and Okemos and other teams like that. And so that's when I stumbled upon them, but it wasn't until I was looking for a third Burke project that I kind of revisited that possibility and then stumbled into this book.
Let's talk about the Page Fence Giants themselves. What was the story of their founding?
They were founded by an integrated ownership group, two black baseball players, Bud Fowler and Grant Homerun Johnson, who was a teenager. They were playing on an integrated baseball team in Findlay, Ohio called the Findlay Sluggers. And they would travel around the Midwest and beat your local team and everything else. Well, they had played a game in Adrian in the late summer of 1894, and the crowd was so large, Bud Fowler had an interview with the local newspaper, and he said he's going to make a traveling black team next year. And he thought he was going to locate it in Findlay, Ohio. But after seeing the crowds in Adrian, he said if Adrian can come up with a $500 guaranteed profit, he would locate the team in Adrian. And a month later, the Adrian newspapers announced the Page Fence Giants were going to be located in 1895 under Bud Fowler and Grant Homerun Johnson in Adrian, Michigan.
Page Woven Wire Fence Company getting involved as their sponsor. Is that the right way to put it?
Yes, they used the black ball team as their marketing tool. And they bought an elaborate train car. I estimated it to cost probably about $30,000 in money back at that time. It was outfitted with sleeper berths and carpeting and china and a full kitchen and leather seats. And they traveled from town to town. And then the local fence dealer, usually a hardware store, would set up a display at the ballpark and would kind of say, basically, if you think this team is high quality, what do you think about our fence? Why don't you buy our fence? And they traveled around about 11 Midwest states in Ontario, Canada from 1895 to 1898 as a sponsoring title of the Page Fence Woven Wire Company and playing baseball at about an 88% winning clip.
You mentioned, besides Bud Fowler, besides Homerun Johnson, from locally in Adrian, there was the former mayor, Len Hoke, right? And a couple of brothers who helped co-found the team.
Howard and Rolla Taylor had come from Ohio. They were sons of bankers, and they located a hardware store, which morphs into kind of a sporting goods store as well. And they were real big baseball fans. And they got together with the former mayor, and who was the current postmaster in Adrian, and they concocted this scheme to be the management team along with Fowler and Johnson. And so that's the 5-member group that starts the Page Fence Giants in Adrian during that time.
Before we get into the Page Fence Giants actually playing games, do you mind if I ask you, Garrett Homerun Johnson, as you mentioned, he's a teenager at the time.
Yes.
Do you mind giving a bit of background into Bud Fowler?
Bud Fowler is a tumbleweed in professional baseball. He is an African-American gentleman who we believe his first paid game was a pitcher in 1877 in Lynn, Massachusetts. He was one of the first full-time, if not the first full-time, Black professional baseball player. He played for decades. He often fudged about his age because he wanted to be the oldest professional. And he was somebody that he played on the Lansing team for a month in 1895 after leaving the Page Fence Giants. He played in teams in Greenville, Michigan. A few years earlier, he played in upstate New York, New Mexico, but he was somebody that many experts believe he should be in the Baseball Hall of Fame. He organized dozens of teams and was often the best player, and unfortunately was oftentimes run out of a league as being a best player due to the color of his skin.
Let's talk about some of the other members of the Page Fence Giants. Where do you even want to begin?
Well, one of the most intriguing persons was a substitute player that only played a few games by the name of William Wendell Gaskin, who we believe was born in Lansing, Michigan. And he went to elementary school in Lansing. As a matter of fact, his dad was a former enslaved person born in Kentucky who was a blacksmith in Lansing in the 1870s and 1880s. His blacksmith shop was where Sparrow Hospital is in 1878 on the corner of Cedar and Michigan Avenue. And then the family lived along Pennsylvania, along Larch Street near Kalamazoo in 1880. And they also lived in Pennsylvania and Michigan, right by the ballpark in 1878. The family eventually relocates to Jackson and then to Adrian. But John Gaskin was a prominent business person. It was said he was the first blacksmith east of the river in Lansing. I guess that was a big deal in the 1870s. But Gaskin is the full-time chef and to cook food for the players for the first 2 years. But he also is like a civil rights icon. He's a penmanship whiz. He owns restaurants. But he grew up and went to school in Lansing, and he pitched in a couple of games, not too well in at least one of them, but he's a direct Lansing connection to the Page Fence Giants club.
So we've mentioned Bud Fowler, Homerun Johnson. Should we take a little bit more time to talk about Grant Homerun Johnson?
Yeah, I think he's another person that should probably be in the Baseball Hall of Fame. He was the preeminent African-American slugger in the 1890s, early 1900s. He supposedly in a winter league outbatted Ty Cobb when Ty Cobb was in his prime with a better batting average, playing down, I believe, in Cuba. He supposedly hit 58 homers in 1894, the year he came to, well, the year before they started the Page Fence Giants. He was a slugger that gave legitimacy to your ball team during this time. He also was in the semifinal group in 2006 that the Baseball Hall of Fame considered, as was Bud Fowler, for the induction when they put in a lot of the African-American ball players back then. So he made the first and second round of cuts about 15 years ago.
As you mentioned, Bud Fowler was not involved with the team for very long, but the team 1895, 1896, 1897, 1898, they're winning over 100 games a season. Whoever is playing for them, they're overwhelmingly the best.
Yes, and by about 1897, all of the black ball players had been run out of organized or white baseball, both at the major and the minor league level. So you basically had 3 or 4 major teams in the Midwest and the East, full of all-star baseball players who would have been playing in what we would call the majors, but they were relegated to these barnstorming teams playing minor league teams and such. But like Bill Bingo was a player that lived in Lansing for a while in the 1890s. He was born in the Detroit area, spent time in Pontiac, and grew up in Oakland County. He was a fantastic hitter who played into his 40s. And eventually plays for a talented team in St. Paul called the Colored Gophers that are quite good. So he's another Lansing and Michigan connection to this. And the best pitcher was a guy named George Wilson, born in Palmyra, 6 miles to the east of Adrian, who also played for the Adrian Demons, which was an integrated team in the Michigan State League that Lansing had the Senators in. And he went 29-4 in 1895, but he also pitched games after the season for the Page Fence Giants and then pitched 3 more years. I think he's Hall of Fame worthy as well, a great left-hander with kind of an underhand delivery. So you look at Binga and Johnson and Fowler. Also, Saul White played on the team. He is in the Baseball Hall of Fame, and he actually replaced Bud Fowler in June of 1895 as the second baseman. Fowler kind of had a falling out with management and quit the Page Fence Giants.
Mitch, how great was the reputation of the Giants?
They could go into a farm community of 200 or 300 residents and draw 2,000 to 3,000 fans. People came from all around. They were known, at least in their early years, of dressing up in red fireman's hats, bicycling on Monarch bicycles, and kind of Pied Pipering through the town, announcing that follow us to the ballpark today. They were the best of the ball players. There's no doubt about that. Charlie Grant, who was a second baseman on the team, was tried to be described as a Native American in 1901 to secretly get him to play for, I think, the Baltimore Orioles under John McGraw, and he was quickly discovered to be African American. But they were talking about paying, $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 to get the release from these players. So these were stellar athletes who were banned due to racism in baseball at the time.
Speaking with the historian Mitch Lutzke, who wrote the book The Page Fence Giants, A History of Black Baseball's Pioneering Champions. The 1896 series that they played against the Cuban X Giants is spotlighted as one of their highest moments for the team. Let's talk about that series. How did that come together?
Well, you often marketed your team as the best in the East, the best in the West, the best in the South. And there were several teams that wanted to be the best of the Midwest. And so through some letters between the ownership group of the Page Fence Giants and the Cuban X Giants, they decided to have a series. Now, originally the series was going to be 12 games, then it went to 14, then it went to 15, then it went to 17, then it went to 19, because they kept drawing crowds. And they traveled around Ohio, Indiana, and Michigan, and they played games. So this was like a traveling Black World Series in Black baseball. And they ended up winning. The game was in Cairo, Michigan, up in the Thumb, and Grant Homerun Johnson pitched. I'm guessing the other pitchers' arms were tired, and they won the game, and they were declared the Black baseball champions. They continued to play out the series because they had sold tickets and were making money. And then when the Cuban X Giants, I think, needed more money, they tacked on 2 more games, which weren't really serious. And then there was this postseason letter writing in several national magazines, including the Sporting News, about, well, the Cuban X Giants lost because they were the older guys with a bunch of Charlie horses, but they had actually had more hits, which has no bearing on the game because it's runs. But it was captured by the national media, and you could get game snippets about most of the games in the media in the Midwest at the time. So it was a well-known event going on at this time.
Were there any other moments that, as you were reading through the clippings about the Page Fence Giants, that stood out to you?
Well, in some communities, they were mistreated horribly. People threw things at them and said, every word you can imagine. And I never found any time that they, stormed into the bleachers like a Ty Cobb with a baseball bat to start whacking people around. They were very intelligent young men. Some of them had attended college, which was unheard of for most Americans in the 1890s. They were said to be of upstanding character. That was part of the prerequisite originally to be on the team. You couldn't be a knucklehead. But I think just the idea that they endured through this racially charged time of Jim Crow, and they had this fabulous train car, which makes it easy to travel, and you don't have to, wait on tickets and stuff. But the real reason was it was a sleeper eating car, because communities would vary as to whether they would rent hotel rooms to a black ball team or would they feed them food. So they would just go into a town, figure out the lay of the land, and they would either go into town or they would eat on the train car, and they would sleep on the train car, or they would go into a hotel. So, and the Klan is around as well in many of these communities in the Midwest. So if you're embarrassing the local yokels too much, your exit from the community may not be as smooth as you want. I think people downplay that. So they had to do some coping skills. If they were blowing out teams, they would do shadow ball and cartwheel around the bases after home runs and, announce, I'm going to strike you out on 3 pitches. But there was that racial animosity going on in communities around the Midwest and Canada, that they had to step across those landmines while they're playing a sport that they love in their full-time occupation.
The Lugnuts are going to wear black and maroon Page Fence Giants uniforms. When did they wear these uniforms, and what other uniforms did they wear?
Interestingly enough, baseball coverage of the Page Fence Giants was pretty heavy in 1895 and 1896 in Adrian. But it dies off in 1897 and 1898. They don't play many games in Adrian because they're a traveling team. So we don't know about the uniform design. The one that the Lugnuts are wearing tonight on the Saturday Tribute is their original uniform from 1895, which was black with a burgundy leathering and black pants with tan socks. That was it. The ball cap was kind of one of the box ball caps, I think is what they call them in the 1970s. I know the Cardinals and the Pirates kind of had those
box.
Yeah, thank you. That's what I was looking for. That was a type of hat. The next year, they had a little bit different design, a little bit more brown and burgundy from what we can find. But the other 2 years, we don't know. But we're real confident because of media results. And there was really a cool deal in 1895 for Adrian. So this is their first year uniform. I'm actually wearing one made out of wool, so it gets a little warm and scratchy with the black and the burgundy.
When you say we, the historians who've so far done work into sharing more information about the Page Fence Giants, besides you, who else?
Dr. Leslie Heapy has done some work. She's at Kent State Stark. Larry Lester, who's probably the preeminent African-American Black baseball, Negro baseball expert at Kansas City. He was very complimentary of my book. And those are the two off the top of my head. Dr. James Brunson has just done a wide study of Black baseball in general. But this was a team that no book had been written on. And I think the largest article I saw on them ever in 120 years was maybe 6 pages in some sort of academic journal. There was almost nothing on this team. So I was fortunate enough to get some support from some colleagues when I reached out, and they said, go for this, write this book. So this is their story. I've just put it into the spotlight.
Mitch, what led to the end of the team following 1898?
There was always speculation about that. In my book, I come up with several things, but it wasn't really dramatic, actually. The team had always made money, and they were still traveling on the road, drawing good crowds. But a couple of things happened. The Spanish-American War in 1898 had taken a lot of the focus off of baseball and focused on the Spanish-American War. There was a National Guard unit in Adrian who had often been ball players, so there was kind of some focus on that. But actually, it was the Steel Trust. And the Page Fence Company was having a hard time getting raw materials if you did not buy from the steel makers in the East Coast. So it was hard to justify an expensive marketing tool, the team and the train car, when you couldn't make the fencing. And so they actually made a steel mill, the Page Fence Company, in Pennsylvania to go around that. And they just decided, I think, from what I read, that they couldn't do this. They couldn't market for a product they could not make at an acceptable level. And then it was sold to a African-American gentleman's club, and they became the Columbia Giants for the next 2 years in Chicago, Illinois.
Mitch Lutzke's book, The Page Fence Giants, A History of Black Baseball's Pioneering Champions, won the Robert Peterson Recognition Award from the Society of American Baseball Research. Mitch, any final thoughts as we conclude?
No, I just think it's an interesting story of America at its time. And I would say I get equal comments from baseball fans who enjoyed knowing about the Superstar Championship team for the first time, but also from people that just want to know about America, about sport, about society, about race. And it's got a really cool cover. but it's a broader story than just game summaries and this guy did this and whatever. It talks about it, but it talks about America at that time. And as a sociology teacher, I thought that was important to put the story into an American history context. So it's a much broader.
I completely agree. And I'm glad that you have helped bring this to the fore. The Page Fence Giants are going into the Michigan Baseball Hall of Fame on Saturday, June 19th at Jackson Field in Lansing, Michigan. Mitch Lutzke, historian, junior varsity baseball player. It was a tough team.
I
But
led the team in stolen bases as a pinch runner. I was 7 for 7. So there's my claim to fame.
Outstanding. The Herb Washington of your day.
Yeah, yes, I was.
Thank you so much, Mitch, for your time.
Thank you, Jesse, and the Lugnuts.